Hello and welcome to Solving Climate Change Once and For All. I'm Bi Huye, and thanks so much for joining us for this online series where we're interviewing experts and entrepreneurs to hear from them in their diverse fields and understand what we can apply from their research to climate solutions and, more importantly, to climate justice. You'll leave with the number one thing that you can do to make a positive impact. I'm delighted today to be joined by Tatiana Schlossberg. She's a critically acclaimed author, former New York Times journalist, and passionate environmentalist. Thanks so much for joining us, Tatiana.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start at the beginning of your journey with climate and the environment. Can you tell us about the day you started your work in journalism?
It's hard to remember the day that I started because I've been doing this since, in a way, since I was in high school, working on school newspapers and stuff like that. But my professional career started at the Bergen Record, which is a local newspaper in New Jersey, and I started soon after I graduated college and didn't know anybody, didn't know where anything was, and the first thing that my editor told me was, you're responsible for 3 to 5 stories a week. And if you don't come up with that many stories, you're not doing your job, which was terrifying, but a good kind of trial by fire of sort of having to figure out, what was going on in the 6 towns that I covered and what were the issues facing those communities and in the ways that I could. And I was there during Hurricane Sandy and some of the other kind of big news events at that time. And so that was, one event that kind of, I think looking back, I think is one of the things that made me interested in climate change journalism. But because the stories were so interesting and compelling and seeing how different communities responded to this crisis and that, obviously different communities were affected differently and disproportionately based on their race and income, but no one was unaffected, and kind of, figuring out the different stories and narratives and also being a part of a local news organization at a time that people really needed that was a really exciting opportunity for me.
Definitely. Yeah, in times of crisis, I think that's when you see the power of community, as we're seeing now in the middle of our global pandemic. I'm curious, was there a tipping point for you in terms of focusing on environmentalism in your journalism?
I had become more interested in it after I worked at the newspaper in New Jersey. I went to graduate school and I got a master's in history, and I read a lot of environmental history, which I hadn't before, or kind of hadn't approached it as a discrete topic. And I really liked it because I think so often we study history as just sort of what people are doing or the history of politics. And that's interesting, as are the history of ideas, but you can't separate that from the world that we all live in. And I think especially in America, we are a country that was built on the acquisition of resources and the use of natural resources. And so it was a new way to understand the history of this country in particular. I think so much of our present attitudes towards climate change we can understand within that historical context in terms of, thinking about, America has always been, or we've thought of America as a land of limitless resources and kind of limitless abundance, and that there always will be more. And I think that we're kind of running up against the edges of that in terms of what are the limits of consumption and what kind of consumption is responsible. And that kind of free enterprise takes precedence over a lot of other things. We're seeing, I guess, the limits of that too. So I don't know if it's a tipping point, but it was a really strong intellectual interest for me. And, when I was working at the New York Times at the beginning, after graduate school, I was a reporter on the Metro desk. And one of the things that I was doing was I wrote this early morning news column for New York called New York Today. And one of the things that I had to do was write the weather every day. And so obviously weather, as we all know, is different from climate, but that was like, I really liked I could call up people at the National Weather Service and talk to them about, what was going on and kind of seeing trends. And I really enjoyed that as well. And it was, a part of it wasn't something that I had done before in my reporting, that kind of following something every single day. And I really liked getting to think about weather and science and, even in New York City, which we often think of as so kind of disconnected from the natural world.
Yeah, I think those are really interesting origins to kind of put together something that's daily and consistent in terms of reporting on weather, which might feel mundane, but to your point, to find trends in that and insights, and then connecting it back to this broader kind of movement or impact that we're seeing across climate, right? Something you said about the history of environmentalism, and particularly in America, being built on acquisition of resources really strikes me. The focus of this series is climate justice, and I'm curious what that means to you, how you define it, and why do you think it's so often overlooked in this work?
It's a big question. I think, obviously I think we can look at climate and environmental justice in kind of the day-to-day of what's happening now, but also in the kind of longer durée of history in terms of, who originally lived here, and how people lived on the land and with the land, and how settlers and colonists kind of changed that calculus, and changed what land was used for. And I think the dispossession of indigenous peoples is a huge part of that kind of that long-term story. And I actually, in my undergraduate work and my graduate work, I wrote about Native American history. So that has always been a strong interest of mine, and trying to understand. I think it's a really rich topic in terms of the history of race in this country, but also looking back now, seeing that as a kind of strong environmental interest too, in terms of who owns land and what land ownership means. And I think we see a lot of those issues play out today, because so many of the so much mineral extraction and fossil fuel extraction happens on reservation lands, and kind of who owns those resources, and is it possible to develop that responsibly, and runs up against issues of sovereignty. So should I, as an environmentalist, say that a community in North Dakota shouldn't allow fracking on its land, when it's their land and their resources, and also maybe a way for that community to have resources, money that's difficult to get in other ways. So those issues are really complicated and interesting, but I think foundational to our history and to issues of climate justice. I think in more contemporary terms, in terms of climate change specifically, and also, indigenous communities are around the world are some of the best stewards of the remaining wildlands that we have, but also here are dealing with issues of climate change at different rates than people in the rest of the world, and in the rest of the country. And but in terms of the day-to-day, I think it's impossible to separate both climate change and pollution or environmental degradation in general from dynamics around race and racial injustice. And one of the areas that I've focused on a lot in my work is the issue of coal ash pollution, which is I don't know if people know about it, but it's the byproduct of burning coal for electricity. It's one of the largest solid industrial waste streams in the United States. We produce more than 100 million tons of it every year. It contains all kinds of heavy metals that are hazardous to human health, and it's mostly stored in water, and usually in kind of stored not well, and often infiltrates groundwater supplies, but also, and groundwater moves, so gets into drinking water, but also is often kind of stored in dammed off sections of rivers and lakes, and so can pollute waterways that are used for drinking and recreation. And in 2008, there was a major coal ash spill in Tennessee where a dam at a TVA plant collapsed and released billions of gallons of this toxic material into a river in Tennessee, buried 300 acres of land in sludge. Most of the waste was carted away to a landfill outside a predominantly Black community in Alabama. And the workers who cleaned up the spill were not given the correct protective equipment. They recently won a lawsuit against the contracting firm because more than 20 people died and 200 workers were made sick by exposure to this material. That happened in 2008. It's one of the largest environmental disasters in American history, and I never heard about it until I started reporting on the topic. And that's a luxury, and I think it's a luxury not to have to know what coal ash is. And I live in New York City, and I'm a privileged white person, and so it doesn't pollute my groundwater and my air. But for millions of Americans, it's something they live with every day, and they're disproportionately non-white communities, low-income communities, and in rural areas. So I think that disaster particularly is a really powerful encapsulation of this idea of climate and environmental justice, in that some communities are disproportionately exposed to this pollution, and they're disproportionately exposed based on their race, their income, and where they live, but also the way that it was cleaned up. The waste was brought outside a predominantly Black community, and that's too often we see that non-white communities, particularly Black communities and Hispanic communities, are disproportionately exposed to all kinds of pollution, and it's really difficult to often to prove like links of health problems, and also to get justice and redress for environmental issues. And it's not just industrial pollution. It's things like non-white communities are disproportionately live closer to roads and highways, and so they are disproportionately exposed to pollution from vehicles, and that causes all kinds of problems like asthma. The rates of childhood asthma for Black children is 8 times higher than it is for white children. For adults, it's 3 times, and leads to premature death in the tens of thousands. So I tend to think of I think about environmental justice as kind of encompassing all these issues, and climate change as well is a part of that. And in terms of coal ash, a lot of the ponds are in the American Southeast. They're in floodplains. Floods are becoming more frequent and stronger because of climate change, and so those communities are even more at risk of exposure to this. So I think we are seeing more and more around the world the disproportionate impacts of climate change, and that it affects disproportionately brown, Black, and indigenous people, mainly women, in the global South. But also in this country, we see not only are those communities disproportionately impacted, but they're less able to recover. And I think we're seeing that we see that in climate change because that's what's true in our society. And I think we're seeing it in terms of how the coronavirus, how its impacts are playing out as well. So it really is an all-encompassing issue. And I think it's hard to write about climate change and not think about these issues. But I think because climate change particularly has been so often framed as a story about science, or a story about nature, that we think less about the people. And I think the environmental movement in general, and kind of conservation issues around that in particular, has suffered by being an issue that is seen as white or led by white people, because people of color are the people who are living with it every day and have been for decades.
That is such a powerful, real, tangible example of how it's played out, and particularly for people who are thinking about climate work, environmental justice every day, that it's so hard to find these stories. If not for journalists like you that went and sought it out and really exposed it from this human aspect, like you're saying. So thank you for sharing that. And it brings me to this point of complicity that I think a lot of climate activists or any kind of social justice person might struggle with the realization that we are complicit in the very problem we're trying to solve, right? That none of us are perfect. It's impossible to be so, and it's not even really the point. But in getting to this point of realizing that actions that I have taken, or being simply in the current societal frameworks that we're in, are adding to the structure of the problem that we're trying to tackle. So I am curious, how have you reconciled with that relationship or realization of being complicit, and with all of the work that you're doing to kind of tackle these challenges at the same time?
Yeah, it's it's not easy. I think we were all born into a world that uses fossil fuels, and which is not to say that we're not complicit or that we're not responsible, but I think it's not anyone's fault that they live in a world where, like, you need a car and a car needs gasoline because you have to drive to work or school or whatever it is. And so but I think it's really hard to move through life and understand that you are contributing to this problem, and that, like, every little bit does make it worse. And one of the examples that I write about in my book, so I write about the coal ash story, but earlier in the book I write about the internet, and because of kind of the infrastructure of the internet and the history of it, it's much of the infrastructure, like data centers in particular, are located in places that run predominantly on fossil fuels. And Amazon Web Services, which hosts a lot of the internet, has a lot of data centers in Ohio, and Ohio uses a lot of coal. So I can be in New York and my electricity might not be coming from coal, but I'm using the internet, and so there is a demand for electricity being created in Ohio that produces coal ash that some other person lives next to the storage pond or landfill. And so I think I don't use that example to say that we're all industrial polluters by watching Netflix or using Amazon, but more to say that we are all involved in the system, and therefore we all have a role in fixing it. So I think the way that I try to deal with that issue of complicity is to say that I don't think that we should feel guilty. I don't think we should feel guilty as individuals for climate change, but I think we should feel collectively responsible for fixing it, for building a better world. And, a world without fossil fuels is a world in which people don't disproportionately suffer from the effects of fossil fuels. And, it's an enormous opportunity to do things differently, but we all have to work on solving that problem. And I don't think that you can solve a problem that you don't understand. So yes, it makes me feel terrible to learn about the history of the internet and realize, like, all the bad things that, watching the Great British Bake Off is doing to the planet. But at the same time, so it's hard to kind of hold those two ideas in your head of, yes, this is the world that I live in, and yes, I have a responsibility to fix it. And understanding it, I hope, instead of making people feel bad, I hope it makes them feel more energized to do something about it, because without solving these problems, we will all remain complicit in them.
Absolutely. And I think that's a powerful way of turning the guilt into that, inevitably people may adapt as you learn more, just like you shared. It's unavoidable, right? But turning that and transforming it into motivation and the collective responsibility to do something that each of us can do. Um, your book, Inconspicuous Consumption, I think tackles this concept really well by uncovering the environmental impact each of us have, maybe unknowingly, just in even in being a conscious consumer.
Mhm.
And I wonder if there's a roadmap you would like to share with listeners in terms of how, in dealing with so much information all the time, notifications, competition for your attention, advertising, um, is there sort of a roadmap for people to help them make more responsible decisions?
Mhm. Well, if you read my book, you will see that there are not a ton of answers to those kinds of questions, because what I suspected but was confirmed by my research is that it's really hard to make a sustainable choice. I mean, a truly sustainable choice, and that everything has an impact. Obviously, there are some things that are better than others. And it's important to kind of be aware of the different relative impacts. But I think we have put way too much pressure on the consumer to make the responsible choice. And, if I'm standing in a store, I can't, if I'm choosing between two pair of jeans that I probably don't need, it's going to be impossible for me to figure out which one of those use less water to produce. And so, but the companies that produce these goods know that, or should know that. And so I think we need to move where the accountability is on the spectrum, away from, I mean, we are accountable in that we need to make demands of companies, but companies need to be more accountable to consumers and also to the communities from which they extract resources. So I think, and that's why I emphasize this issue of, collective responsibility, because, these changes don't just happen. Individuals make them happen. And so I encourage people to demand at least transparency from the companies that they shop from, because if we don't know where things are coming from, there's no way for us to do things better.
Yeah.
And, I think in general, a roadmap is like, just trying to consume less, thinking about what you want versus what you need, which, that's not how we're trained as Americans. But, I think for me, like, I have learned to, take a lot of satisfaction from just looking at clothes online and imagining what my life would be like if I owned them. But,
Awesome.
but, I think, I don't think that there's a roadmap, because I don't think that, because it's too hard, and it's really complicated to actually figure anything out. And so what other than kind of consuming less, or doing the things that a lot of us have heard, like eating less meat and dairy, or flying less, or, riding your bike to work, I think it's, like, pick one thing that you really care about and then make an effort there. And once you kind of figure out how to do that, then you can try something else. But whether it's, becoming vegetarian, or trying to not buy any plastic, or composting, or, we can't all do everything, but everyone can do one thing. And so I think I would encourage people to do that, because the only thing that makes it easier to do more is to do something. And we all have to start somewhere.
Definitely. And I think you've already answered this in terms of, distilling your research, your work into one actionable tip for our audience to take on. And it sounds like it's that you pick one thing. It doesn't have to be an overhaul of your life, but it allows you to take action, and from there you can adopt, do it more or adopt something that's supplemental to that, if it's your diet, if it's your transportation, if it's just your waste footprint. um,
Yeah, I mean, I think that the other thing I would say, I think we tend to think of issues of, behavioral change as related to consumption, but the single most important individual action is to vote and to get engaged in the political process. And we don't usually think of that as like a behavioral change or an individual action in this respect, but it absolutely is. And it's the most important thing to do, because the most effective way to make these changes are at the policy regulatory level. And, we need to elect people who understand that and who are willing to make those changes, as opposed to dealing with the status quo as if the status quo has no cost. And I think in particular, like we often see this issue as like a national and international issue. And so much of the emphasis is like on the Paris Agreement, but most of policy for climate change happens at the state and local level. And those are much easier places to make a difference, in your own community and in your own state. Like states decide where their electricity comes from, or where their waste goes. And that kind of thing actually really does matter. So that's what I always say is the most important behavioral change or individual action.
Hear, hear. Definitely. I think a lot of your work has focused on the pressure individuals can apply across their society, right? To shift the responsibility back to companies where you might be a consumer, or like you pointed out, to the local governments, the people in positions of power that are shaping the decisions that create the systems that we live in, right? Where your power is procured or produced, how it's sourcing from either extractive industries or renewable energy. Um, what do you expect governments and institutions, let's say people take on that behavioral change of being civically engaged, what do you expect them to do in order to mobilize around climate solutions better?
Well, I think that governments need to do a better job incentivizing sustainability and action on climate for business. I think making it easier rather than more difficult to to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or invest in clean energy technology, or not having to manufacture. I mean, this is an example I use all the time, is light bulbs. So for instance, this is not an incentive, but I think it's a way that governments can help. But we were meant to have a regulation go into effect at the beginning of this year that would phase out incandescent bulbs entirely, and the Trump administration has delayed that. But if all of the light bulbs are efficient, are compact fluorescents or LEDs, it's not on the consumer to make that choice of which light bulb to buy, because all of the light bulbs are efficient, and last longer, and are not kind of using up energy unnecessarily. And so that, I think, is a way that governments are challenging businesses to stop producing this harmful thing, and it affects our behavior as consumers. So that's a kind of an example of where they all come together. But I think we need to figure out, governments need to figure out how to make all of these externalities of industrial and commercial output, like pollution, for instance, they need to internalize the cost of that. And I think, for example, it's like cheaper to produce things in Vietnam or China, because no one's paying for the actual cost of producing that, whether it's the, pollution and the environmental harm caused in those countries, or the ocean acidification from shipping these things all over the world, the sulfur dioxide pollution in ports. They're not paying for any of that, but we are all paying for that as a society in terms of the effects to our air and water, or in our healthcare costs. So we need a carbon tax or a polluting tax, and polluters are the ones who need to pay for that. And I think that institutions are seeing that, that companies need to be better stewards of the environment, and that consumers actually care about that now. But I think a lot of that will require a shift from, valuing success in terms of growth and in terms of immediate return and profit, and that we need to think of success as more than just growth in revenue or GDP for countries. That we need to think of it more as, how does the whole community benefit, and how do we maximize both our returns, but also the good that we're doing, over the long haul, and not just from quarter to quarter.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that triple bottom line. It's not just the economic bottom line, but it's also how are we protecting the planet and thinking about serving stakeholders in the community in which we're working and serving. And then I think another important point you made is the time frame. Is it a payback of 1 year, of 5 years, or are we truly thinking about the long-term implications of decisions we're making here and now for the future, for the next generation, which has become a lot more vocal, thankfully, and what about us? What about beyond your, corporate bottom line today? I'm curious, I'm sure you've seen a lot of, being on the front lines, kind of the horror stories, right? Of like the coal ash example, the stories that aren't being written about in terms of climate change, but also climate justice. Can you share the most shocking thing you've learned in your work as related to climate justice?
Yeah, I think, coal ash is probably the one, because I think we hear about coal all the time, but we hear about it in terms of like emissions or miners, but we don't hear about this pollution, which is not going anywhere. Like, we're going to be dealing with coal ash pollution forever. And I got interested in it from a story that I reported, not the spill that I mentioned earlier, but just a lawsuit in Tennessee that was a group of environmental groups were suing TVA for Clean Water Act violations at a different plant over many decades. And they had, in the 70s, this plant they were responsible for dumping more coal ash into the Cumberland River, which supplies drinking water to Nashville, than in all of the oil that spilled in the BP oil spill in 2010, Deepwater Horizon. And so, it is this major threat. And a lot of the advocates that I spoke with, said that this is another environmental disaster waiting to happen. And I think it's not, it's slow moving, as with a lot of problems that, are kind of contained by climate change itself, but also the things that cause it and the things that it contains. So it's hard to incentivize that kind of long-term thinking, and also kind of preparing over the long term. The first ever federal regulation governing coal ash disposal came in 2015 as a response to the 2008 spill, and it was the first thing that Andrew Wheeler announced that he was rolling back when he became acting administrator of the EPA. So, who does that benefit beyond utilities and coal companies? Nobody. And, I think we all suffer. I mean, there are communities that suffer distinctly and acutely, but we all suffer by living in a country that allows certain people to, be disproportionately affected because of who they are and where they live. I think, another thing that was shocking to me and was really interesting which I also wrote about in my book, was this issue of wood pellet, burning wood pellets for energy, and which is it's something that they're doing in Europe now, because the EU had their renewable energy directive required that they get 20% of their electricity from renewables by 2020, and become 20% more efficient. But a lot of the renewable energy that they're getting is from burning wood, because wood is seen as renewable because the trees will grow back, but also because of this loophole in the original IPCC report. Forestry is counted as a land use change no matter how the wood is used, so the emissions are not counted from burning the wood. And these plants that are burning the wood get all kinds of subsidies meant for renewable energy development. But what was the most shocking, that was like, I can't believe that. But and some of the wood is coming from Europe, but a lot of the wood, particularly to the UK, is coming from the US. And it's mainly coming from the American Southeast. And, it's supposed to be, in theory, is coming from pine plantations. But a lot of it is coming from old growth hardwood forests. And, I think the American South, similarly with coal ash, there's not the same kind of tradition, I guess, of environmentalism, and it is home to a lot of industrial pollution, and then also, environmental disasters like the coal ash spill or the BP oil spill or Hurricane Katrina and hurricanes in general. And, clearing all these forests makes the effects of all those things, the effects of climate change, the effects of hurricanes, flooding, affects water quality, air quality, makes it all so much worse. And I don't think we hear about that at all. And making the pellets themselves produces a lot of pollution, that is relatively unregulated or unmonitored. And so I think the things that were shocking to me were that, beyond the fact that it happens at all, just the idea that of how much people are willing to sacrifice in the short term, but also how opaque this is, these kinds of issues are to the people who live in the communities that where this stuff is going on. And I think, nobody wants to live next to a coal ash pond, and nobody wants their forests to be cleared. And those are issues that should unite people across the political spectrum, but it's hard to know about them unless you are directly affected, and even then hard to do something about. And so I think these are the kinds of issues that require collective mobilization. They require people in other places to care, and not to care like in a condescending way or, to come in as an outsider and say, you really should be caring about this, but supporting environmental protection and, healthier, cleaner air and cleaner water and healthier communities in a supportive way. And I hope that my work and kind of writing about these issues can help with that.
Absolutely. And I think that it's two parts, like you said. It's knowing about the issues and being able to uncover what's really happening and the extent of which they're so far off from what we should be doing, right? There's a level of almost ridiculousness in the loopholes, right, and the irony of using wood as a renewable energy.
Right, when it's also dirtier than coal. It's like how can that still be possible? But anyway.
But I think your point about who even knows about this, right? People look at the IPCC and they think, well, that's great. That's a step forward. It's progress. It's a plan. It's putting together really tangible steps for us to take collectively around the world. And so it's one part, even knowing to go uncover these stories. And then the second part about once you've identified it, how to make it transparent so that, again, people can mobilize around demanding that from companies and from institutions, and then taking the action, back to your advice on, changing habits within your scope, but then also voting, right? Being civically engaged so that you are putting people in those roles that will hopefully stop these loopholes and stop the opaqueness from continuing. It's a heavy topic, and I think that, for these issues, they have a really long time span. You said coal ash is not something that we will be able to stop dealing with. It's already kind of too late in a certain aspect of what's been done, and now we have to think about adaptation instead of just mitigation. Where do you derive hope out of all of this?
Well, it's not always easy, but I think my interest in history, I think, is helpful in that way, because I know that it is possible for people to make a difference. And I think, we don't have to look back that much farther than the first Earth Day 50 years ago, and all the organizing that took place around that. I mean, just thinking that 20 million Americans participated in Earth Day, which was at that time, 10% of the population, but also that, organizers, targeted 12 congressional elections. The 12 members of Congress with the worst environmental records defeated 7 of them. And from the, in the 1972 midterm election. And from that, without that, we probably wouldn't have the strong environmental laws that we do, like the Clean Water Act and the expansion of the Clean Air Act and the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. So I think, again, the clean air and clean water, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it doesn't happen by accident. It happens because we do something about it. And so I think that, that gives me hope, as does the fact that, how engaged and committed the, generation below mine is on this issue, and that they understand that it's not just recycling or bringing your own bag to the grocery store. Like, yeah, you should do that, but they seem to understand the kind of structural and systemic framing of this issue, and that that's the scale on which this needs to happen. And so, just in my own work, I've been writing about this topic now for just over 4 years, and there's a huge difference between when I started writing about climate change and now, in terms of it's not like everyone talks about it all the time, but it's much more central in discussions, especially like in the presidential election, and I think just people are more aware of it because we did have a couple of years with a lot of really bad, environmental disasters in which it's hard not to see a climate change signature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love looking back to look forward and gaining hope from trusting in people ultimately, even in, the situation that we're in, and then looking to the next generation who really has been so vocal, active, and understanding of the power of mobilizing communities, peacefully protesting, making it known that, this problem is here and that we are responsible for changing it for them. What would you say, in looking across your work, your writing, your research, what are we missing? What, you mentioned it's more central and mainstream, and you can definitely see that in terms of the kind of mainstream dialogue, but what's one thing everybody's overlooking?
I think that we're too focused on, not that things like how many climate change questions are in the presidential debates is meaningless, but like that's not that important because every question is a climate change question. Every story is a climate change story, and climate change is a story about everything. And so I think, we miss a ton of opportunities by not thinking of our world as a world that is currently and already and always dealing with climate change. I think that it's a fantasy to think that we can separate climate change from anything else that's going on. And even things that don't seem to have anything to do with climate change probably do, or they will. So I think, understanding that this is embedded in everything, and and I wish that more, like that it wasn't just climate journalists who were writing about climate change. I wish that everyone were more informed so they could write about it in a responsible way, but also that they were thinking about these issues in that way.
Absolutely. And I think that is more apparent now with COVID-19. If you don't believe in interconnectedness, then it's hard to convince you otherwise. And right, public health, immunology, viral diseases, that's also all connected to a warming climate. So yeah, that's definitely a huge point that is being overlooked. So we're coming to the end of our interview, and my final question for you is, what's been your favorite aha moment in the course of your career, an epiphany that you think would be meaningful to share with our audience?
I think kind of waking up to that realization that it's climate change is not a science story or a nature story or a technology story or an energy story, that it really is, it's about people and culture and history and all the different things that I wrote about in my book. But I think, more recently I wrote an article for Bloomberg about this study. The topic is kind of obscure, but it was a tree ring study that showed that the coldest decade in Scotland was from 1695 to 1705. So it was the coldest decade in Scottish history within the Little Ice Age, which is the coldest period in Europe, that lasted for a couple hundred years and kind of ended in the early 19th century. But anyway, the authors kind of used tree rings to prove that, and then argued that the kind of extreme cold had a lot of political consequences and cultural consequences. There was famines. 10% of the population died. A lot of people invested a lot of money in a ill-fated colony in Panama. And a lot of people from Scotland went to Panama to set up a colony, which failed. And so they lost a ton of wealth and a ton of people died. And after this cold decade ended in 1705, 2 years later was when Scotland officially became part of the United Kingdom and joined as a political entity with England. And so even though there were bad famines or ill-fated ventures later, they never kind of suffered the complete collapse that they had after that, or during that decade. And so it made me really think about how communities, what we can learn from that in terms of, okay, the authors released it right before Brexit officially happened. So, their argument was that in a world that's dealing with climate change, these issues don't stop at borders, and we all have to be thinking about these together, and we're more powerful together than we are apart. But I think, it comes back to the point that I was making at the beginning, which is that, the climate change that we're dealing with now is, I think, a particularly intense and new phenomenon, but people have been dealing with versions of climate change or environmental change forever. And, hoping that we can learn from history in the ways that people responded and what was successful, but also not imagining that the rest of our society, most people probably look at the colony in Panama and don't connect it to the Scottish cold spell. But that, everything that we do is connected to the physical world that we live in. And so I think kind of understanding that in a more, hopefully systematic way of thinking for myself was just really, really powerful, and hopefully will shape my work going forward.
It's certainly a unique perspective, and I think a very powerful one. I love it, and it's a super powerful takeaway for me to look backwards, to look forward, right? To think about what the intersection of history and all of the kind of people aspects of that history were shaped by something that you don't think necessarily has a human fingerprint on it, but from their climate. So wow, that's a super interesting story. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights and uncovering these important, obscure stories that are, just people need to hear about them. And I think it's shaped super in a digestible way in your book, but really love that you were able to bring it out and share it with our audience here. And for all of our listeners to know that you can't do everything, but you can do one thing. And once you do that and see the impact, you can go on to do other things. I think that's really empowering.
You too.
Yeah, really looking forward to the other work that you're doing. I think it's stuff that people need to read and want to read. So thank you.
Thank you. I hope so.